the malt country of Hertfordshire, in the summer of 1826. It was the settled opinion of the whole of Marholm, an opinion the town had arrived at, as the most comfortable opinions always are, by admiring the front of a thing and never once troubling to walk round to the back of it, that a brewhouse was to be trusted in exact proportion to the size of its chimney. The little old brewhouse of Terence had made the town's beer these 40 years from behind a plain oak counter and a low range of tarred weatherboard sheds set against the river by the Wen Bridge, over whose door the name had been painted so long ago that the weather had taken the shine off it. The great new brewery that the Marquess of Calder was, that very summer raising upon the water meadow he called Calder's Mead, did its business from behind a front of new red brick and cut stone so tall, and a chimney so lofty, that a carter bringing down his barley felt he had wandered by mistake into a place of worship, and lowered his voice accordingly. And the town, being human, drew the human conclusion, and began to carry its custom from the plain old counter to the tall new chimney, in the settled certainty that a concern which could afford so much brick must brew a very safe pint indeed. It is worth the setting down, because it is very nearly the whole of the story that follows, for a beer keeps a truer account than any man, and can be neither flattered nor hurried into swearing to a lie. Malt and hops and water do the thing that was done to them in the making, and no other thing. And what was brewed sound will stand a year in the cask and answer for itself. And what was forced will turn, though you paint the barrel with a lord's own arms and christen it before the quality. For it is one of the small mercies of the brewer's trade that it cannot, in the end, be argued with. A town may talk itself into anything. A projector's prospectus will prove whatever its projector is paid to prove. A company may put up a chimney, until it has persuaded the whole of Hertfordshire that a great deal of borrowed steam is a safer thing to trust than 40 years of an honest cellar. But a beer racked green into a foul cask in a hot July will rope and sour by September whatever the ledger says of it, and no amount of subscription will keep sweet a gile that was hurried out of the square before its time. That was the one fact in the whole affair that could not be got round, bought off, or talked over, and it was known, in the May of this history, to exactly one person of any consequence in Marholm, and she was a woman whom the principal gentleman of the neighbourhood was about to advise, before the assembled quality of 3 parishes, to take her opinions to the tap-room and sell them there by the half-pint. On a bright, blowing May forenoon, at the laying of the foundation stone of the great new brewery, the fresh brick scrubbed, a cold collation laid out under a striped awning, the subscribers gathered to congratulate one another upon the fortune they were all about to make. Everard, Marquess of Calder, delivered the judgment that the county would be repeating, with steadily increasing enjoyment and, at his own expense, for the better part of a year. He was the chief proprietor of the concern and the head of its board. The whole scheme had been got up chiefly on the strength of his name and his acres, and a great many opinions he had formed in town upon the science of commerce, the freedom of trade, and the picturesque uselessness of the little old country brewhouses that brewed by hand and by weather, and could not make in a 12-month what his steam should make in a month. In his gloved hand lay the elegant drawing of the affair, prepared by a fashionable London projector, named Mr. Prout, who had never in his life stood over a fermenting square at 4 of a summer morning to feel whether the gile had taken the heat, and who had demonstrated with beautiful figures that a manufactory brewing fast enough and cheap enough must in a very few years engross the entire trade of the county and leave the little brewhouses to the rats and the vinegar fly. A young woman who had come down to the mead with her father, present upon the family's business and asked for her opinion by nobody at all, had just observed, in a level and unhurried voice, that a beer was worth precisely what it was in the publican's cellar 3 months after it left the brewer's, and not 1 farthing of what it was on the morning it was racked, and that a house which meant to brew the whole county's porter in a hurry had best look to its cleanliness and its cellarage a great while before it looked to its steam. The Marquess did not look up from the drawing. A brewhouse is no place for a woman, Miss Tarrant. Beer is brewed by men and drunk by men. Leave the coppers to those who can lift them. And then, still without lifting his eyes, in the tone a gentleman keeps for a draught under an ill-hung door, that little brewhouse by the bridge is finished. Sell the coppers for scrap, and keep to your caudle cup. If Miss Tarrant has views upon the brewing of porter, Miss Pruitt, she may cry them in the tap-room by the half-pint, where I am told a timid ale will always find a timid throat, provided it is offered often enough and in a pot small enough to excuse it. Within the month, Cassandra Tarrant had staked the whole life of her father's brewhouse upon the very cellar he had told her to sell for scrap. And by the Michaelmas after the summer that this history turns upon, for this is very nearly the end of the story, and we shall come round to it in good order. But it is only fair you should know from the first what road the tale is travelling. The Marquess of Calder, the most modern and the least anxious gentleman upon that whole side of the county, would be standing bare-headed at that same plain oak counter, with his tall hat held against his breast, asking the terms of the young woman he had not, that May troubled himself to look at, and the little brewhouse he had offered to buy up and pull down, as a man buys a cottage to be rid of it for the sake of a view, would be, by the common consent of the very town that had laughed at her obstinacy all the summer through, the one house in 3 parishes whose beer had not turned in the great heat, and whose publicans had not been ruined by it. And when his aunt asked him, with the family plainness, what in heaven's name he had meant that morning under the striped awning, his lordship would discover, to his very considerable discomfort, that he could not for the life of him remember what he had meant by it at all. But that is a summer and part of an autumn on. This is the May before, and we must begin where she began, which was, as it happened, standing in the cool dark of the deep cellar of Tarrant's brewhouse with a horn lantern and a small brass gauge, drawing off a little of the strong October ale into a stone bottle to be sealed and laid by. A full hour before the Marquess pronounced her caution a thing for the tap-room, and thinking of nothing on this earth grander than whether the wind would hold in the north another day, and keep the cellar cool enough to let the new mild settle before the heat came on. Cassandra Tarrant cast to the draymen and the cellar and to nobody genteel, for she had never once invited it, Miss Tarrant to the town, and the Tarrant girl to such persons as felt her continued existence wanted a syllable of apology, was 27. The only child of Nathaniel Tarrant of Marholm, common brewer, sole holder of the little old brewhouse that had answered the town's plain thirst for 40 years, and never yet lost a publican the worth of a broken tap. Her mother was 12 years gone. Her father left with a grave, watchful daughter who asked what things cost, and remembered the answer. Did the only sensible thing a busy man could, and put her to use. She had kept the Brewhouse book and a house book, which is to say the account of every public house that took her beer, its lease and its loan and the barrels it drew in a year. Since she was 18, she could tell you to the pound of malt and the pocket of hops what any brew of the last 9 years had cost, and what it had fetched, and to the gallon how much sound beer lay maturing under the brewhouse in the long, cool vaults her grandfather had dug into the chalk. And she had, besides, a rule her father had taught her, as other fathers teach a catechism. A beer is a promise, Cass, old Nathaniel liked to say, and the drinking of it is the payment, and any man alive can brew you a handsome promise in a shining new cask. Never mind the colour of it the day it is racked, nor the fine head it throws in the tap. Ask only what it will be 3 months on, in a cellar that is not your own. Lay a bottle of it by. Time is the one gauge that cannot be got at, for it takes no bribe and keeps no company, and it will tell you in the autumn the exact truth of what you did in the spring, whether you wish to hear it or no. It was from that saying that the trials came, the little sealed stone bottles that were, though nobody in Marholm knew it yet, presently to undo a Marquess. From every brew she made, good or ill, Cass Tarrant drew off a single bottle, and sealed it with wax and her thumb, and wrote upon it in her small square hand the day and the gile and the gauge of it, and laid it upon a shelf in the cool inner vault that the brewhouse called the trial room. And there they stood in their rows, the sound years and the 2 poor ones, going back the better part of a decade, each one a sworn witness laid up against the day some person should stand in the yard and tell her that her beer was not what she said it was. She could walk to that shelf in the dark, and put her hand on the ale of any autumn you named, and draw the cork, and let the town taste for itself what a beer brewed sound and left alone would do. And it was her quiet, unspoken, and entirely accurate opinion that a brewer who dared not do as much was no brewer, but only a seller of a thing while it was too young to contradict him. It is necessary to say plainly, because the parlours of the town said it often, and a good deal less kindly, what Cassandra Tarrant was not. She was not a beauty. Though a long way from plain, she had a clear, composed, attending face, and a way of looking at whoever was speaking as though what they said might presently be weighed against the Brewhouse book and the truth of it. She was not accomplished. She could cast up 3 columns of malt and 2 of duty faster than the Marquess's own clerk. But she could not sing, and had let her drawing lapse at the age when other young ladies took it up. And she was not married, a circumstance the town laid at the door of the ink upon her fingers, and her unwomanly ease about a fermenting square, and her father at the door of the poverty of the arithmetic that had so far offered itself. For she had observed early that a solvent brewer's only daughter draws a particular sort of suitor, had priced that sort with accuracy, weighed him, and found him light, and had declined to give good coin for him. She had, in short, all the qualities that make a woman invaluable behind a counter and invisible in a drawing-room, and had made her peace with the exchange a good while before the Marquess of Calder came down from town to teach her, as he supposed, the difference between the two. That she was not to be trifled with in the matter of a cask, the whole trade had known these 4 years, since the business of the foxed pale ale, and it is worth the telling. For it is the same woman doing the same thing that she would presently do to a lord. A jobber had come to Tarrant's with a bargain. 40 butts of pale ale to be, had cheap of a failing house at Ware, sound as a nut, he swore, and only wanting a buyer with the cellar room to hold it, and old Nathaniel, being tired, and the man being plausible and the price being very low, would have bought. But his daughter had gone down and drawn a mug from 3 casks chosen not by the jobber, but by herself, and had come up and said, in the level voice, that she was very sorry, but that the beer was already foxing at the shive, and would be rope before it was sold, and that a low price on a turning beer was the dearest beer in England. And would he perhaps like to tell her honestly how long it had stood racked, and in whose cellar, for it had plainly not been a cool one. The jobber had gone away without his bargain and without his temper, and it had come out within the 12-month that the whole 40 butts had gone sour on the man who did buy them, and had ruined a small house at Hitchin that could not afford the loss, and the saving of £200 and a year of the Brewhouse's good name had been owing to a young woman who would draw her own mug from her own choosing, and would not sign her father's money to a beer that time had already condemned. The trade had laughed about it, and shaken its head and called her a sharp piece. But the trade had also, quietly, brought its honest bargains to Cass Tarrant ever after, which is the only kind of compliment a brewhouse can bank. It will be as well, before we go on, to say what manner of thing it was that the Marquess proposed to sweep away. For a common brewery is not at all the simple matter that a man who has only drunk the beer supposes. A common brewer, or a wholesale brewer, did not keep an inn nor draw a pint across a bar. He brewed in bulk and sold by the barrel to the publicans who did. And the whole strength and peril of his trade lay not in the brewhouse at all, but in the houses, the public houses that took his beer. For a brewer got his houses and held them by lending. He would advance a struggling publican the money for his license, or his fixtures, or the very lease of his house, and take a mortgage or a bond for it. And the publican, so obliged, was thenceforward a tied house, bound to draw that brewer's beer and no other so long as the debt ran. It was a thing that could be done well or vilely. Done vilely, it was a chain. A hard brewer lent greedily, charged a stiff rent, forced his beer upon the man good or bad, and when the poor devil fell behind as, with bad beer to sell, he must foreclosed and took the house, and put in a new tenant to be ruined in his turn. Done well, it was very nearly a kindness. A fair brewer lent modestly, asked a rent a house could truly pay, sold his publican a sound beer the customers came back for, and carried him patiently through a bad quarter, in the sure knowledge that a solvent publican is worth more to a brewer than a dozen ruined ones and an empty house on his hands. Old Nathaniel Tarrant had done it well for 40 years, and his daughter did it better, and the 11 little houses that drew Tarrant's beer, the malt shovel and the wool pack and the compasses and the rest, were tied to the old brewhouse by a cord a good deal tougher than any mortgage, which was that their landlords had sound beer to sell, and a brewer who did not squeeze them, and knew to a nicety what they would lose if they gave both up for a tall chimney. The whole of it stood or fell, like the wharf and the ledger of older honest trades, upon a single thing, and that thing was soundness. That the beer sent out was truly the beer it was sold for, brewed to its proper strength and so well hopped, and so cleanly made and so coolly kept, that it would live out its journey and its cellarage, and come sweet to the drinker's lip a season after it left the copper. For 40 years, Terence Beer had done exactly that. Old Nathaniel had outlived 2 excise supervisors and a dozen fashions in drink, and not one publican in all that time had sent a cask back to the old brewhouse ropey or sour or short, and the reason was the same reason his daughter kept her sealed bottles, which was that the Tarrants had never once in 2 generations put out a beer they had not first proved to themselves that time would not shame. It was not a glamorous distinction, and it had never once made them rich. But it was the thing that stood in the August of this history between 11 honest publicans and their ruin, and it was kept, gile by gile and bottle by bottle, in a woman's hand. Of Nathaniel Tarrant himself there is not a great deal to say, except that he was a good and honest and frightened old man, which is a harder thing to be than either of the first 2 alone. He had kept his brewhouse straight through a long war and a longer peace by the simple and exhausting method of never once sending out a cask he would be ashamed to broach in his own parlor. But he was aging now, and short of breath, and easily alarmed, and the raising of the Marquess's chimney had frightened him more than any bad harvest in 50 years. For a bad harvest he understood, and a manufactory he did not. He had begun to lean upon his daughter in the way the old lean upon the young, when the world changes its shape faster than they can follow, half in gratitude and half in a querulous fear that she would do something bold and bring the great new gentleman down upon them, and it was one of the quieter heroisms of that summer, and quite unrecorded anywhere but here, that Cassandra Tarrant carried her father's fear as well as her own, and let him see only the one, and held his hand steady upon the pen when it shook, and told him every night that all would be well, upon the strength of a shelf of sealed bottles and a conviction that a sound beer does not lie. Her one ally of any weight was old Barnaby, the cellarman, and he was an ally chiefly in the sense that the chalk itself was an ally, cold, immovable, and exactly where you had left it. Barnaby had scoured the casks of Terence for 50 years, man and boy, with scalding water and a chain and an arm like a smith's, in the sure and simple faith that 9/10 of all the beer ever spoiled in England was spoiled not in the brewing but in a dirty cask, and he kept the deep vaults under the brewhouse at the even cool of the chalk they were cut from, and turned the sealed trials with his own hands, and had for the brewer's daughter the gruff, total unspoken loyalty of an old servant of a good beer for the one young person left in the parish who valued the thing he had given his life to. He had no opinions upon the science of commerce, and none upon the freedom of trade, and would not have crossed the yard to hear Mr. Prout read his figures. But he knew to a degree what heat would do to a green beer in a foul cask, and he could no more have been got to send out a gile before its time than to spit in the mash tun. And when it came at last to the pinch, it would be old Barnaby's cool vault and old Barnaby's scoured casks, standing up behind her sealed bottles that no gentleman's chimney could argue away. The great new brewery was a different notion altogether, and a very modern one. Mr. Prout's beautiful drawing had shown, and the whole county had believed it, because it was printed, and because there was a chimney, that the future of the trade lay not in a string of little brewhouses each making by hand what its own houses could drink, but in a single great steam manufactory that should brew for a whole county at once, faster and cheaper than any hand brewer living, and undersell the little men into their graves. It was, upon paper, unanswerable, and paper was the element in which the whole county had lately learned to live. It was also, as Cass Tarrant had seen at a single glance, and said once, quietly, to a room that was not listening, a scheme with a flaw in it that no chimney could mend. For a beer cannot be hurried. Malt must be mashed at its leisure, and the wort boiled its full hour with hops enough to keep it, and the gile must lie in the square until it has done fermenting and not be drawn off green, because a ledger is impatient, and a manufactory built to brew fast and sell faster, with a great capital crying out for its interest from the very first quarter, would be under a standing temptation, in every hot week of every summer, to rack its beer before its time and force it out into the trade half-made, and trust to the publican's cellar and the drinker's thirst to hide what the brewer had not the patience to cure. A house where everything is done in a hurry, she had thought, is a house where sooner or later everything will be done too soon. And she had looked at the tall raw chimney, and at the smooth, impatient gentleman who was raising it, and had felt the first cold touch of a certainty she had then no evidence for, and no leave to speak. But that was an objection upon the theory of manufactories, and nobody upon that bright May forenoon, with the collation laid out, and the fortunes as good as made, had the smallest wish on earth to hear it. The way the thing was to be done in practice was a good deal less picturesque than the drawing, and it was the part of the business the striped awning had not been raised to discuss. The Marquess did not mean merely to build a great brewery and trust to its cheapness to win the trade. He meant to make certain of the trade first, and brew for it afterward, and he had a man to make certain of it for him. Mr. Pruitt, his man of business, was a dry, close, capable person of middle age, with a soft step and a hard eye and a copperplate hand, who understood to a nicety the one thing about the brewing trade that the projector's figures had left out, which was that a brewery is worth exactly the number of houses tied to it, and not a barrel more. All that spring, while the chimney rose, Mr. Pruitt had been quietly going about the county with the Marquess's money, buying up the debts of the public houses, the little mortgages and bonds and unpaid brewers' scores that lay upon 3 parishes' worth of taverns, and calling them in. A publican who owed a struggling small brewer £30 might shrug at it for years. The same debt, bought up by a Marquess and called in sharp, with a bailiff's civility, was another thing entirely, and the terms of its forgiveness were always the same, and always gentle in the phrasing and iron in the fact. Sign to take the great brewery's beer, or find the whole sum by quarter day. House by house, over that spring, the tall chimney was gathering the town's thirst into its hand before it had brewed a drop, and the little brewers who had served those houses for a generation found their casks refused at doors that had taken them cheerfully at Lady Day, and could get no reason but a shrug and a new painted sign. Against Tarrant's, this engine had been set to work early, and had so far entirely failed, for a reason Mr. Pruitt noted in his book with the particular irritation of a tidy man before an untidy fact. The Tarrant houses would not be bought. Pruitt had gone to the 11 of them with his soft step and his civil terms and his purse, and had found to his surprise that there were scarcely any debts to buy, that Cass Tarrant lent her houses little and asked of them less, so that the malt shovel owed almost nothing, and the wool pack rather less, and what small sums were owing on terms so easy that no publican in his senses would exchange them for a Marquess's mercy, and that even the 2 or 3 houses he might have squeezed would not be squeezed, because their landlords asked plainly whether they would take a stranger's beer to be quit of a friend's. Small loan had looked at him as though he had proposed they sell their own grandmothers, and had gone on drawing Terence. He raised the offer, it made no difference. He hinted at the license and the magistrates, it made rather less. Honest Kettle of the malt shovel, who had drawn Terence ale for 30 years and buried a wife on cast Terence forbearance in a bad winter, told him to his face, over his own bar, that he would sooner sell short measure than sell his customers a beer he could not stand behind, and that he had drunk the Marquis's new porter of a Saturday, and it had given him the gripes, and Mr. Pruitt might carry that back to the mead with his compliments. Pruitt carried back instead a shorter and a graver report, which was that the little brewhouse by the bridge could not be starved out in the ordinary way, because it had done the one thing his whole engine was built to punish, and done it too long ago to undo. It had made itself loved by being fair, and a fairness of 20 years' standing is a mortgage no Marquess can call in. It was at this point, the houses immovable, the chimney not yet lit, and the whole handsome scheme balked by an obstinate spinster and 11 grateful publicans, that the Marquess had gone down to lay his foundation stone, and, being asked by nobody, had been given cast Terence opinion of his cellarage, and had returned it, as we have seen, with the advice about the caudle cup. He had done it carelessly, as a man swats at a fly that has interrupted a pleasant thought, and had forgotten it before the collation was cleared, and it is the mark of the sort of man he then was that he never once considered that the fly might keep a book, or that the whole difference between the two of them, in the end, would be that she remembered exactly what she had said, and precisely why, and he could not afterward recall a word of his own. He had built his brewery upon a projector's figures and a man of business's purse. She had built hers upon 40 years of a clean cellar and a shelf of sealed bottles, and the summer was coming that would draw them both. Her own answer to the striped awning was not a word but a series of transactions, entered that same week in the house book in her small square hand, and calculated with a coolness that would have alarmed the Marquess considerably, had he been the sort of man who reads a woman's ledger. She did not rail, and she did not repine, and she did not, which her father, poor man, had lain awake dreading, go up to the mead to have it out with anybody. She went instead very quietly to her 11 houses, and renewed the leases of the 2 that fell due that year upon terms a shade easier than before, and forgave the Woolpack a quarter's rent it could ill spare against a promise of nothing but its custom, and thereby bound the whole 11 to the old brewhouse, with a cord the Marquis's whole purse could not cut, because it was made of a thing his purse had never learned to buy. Then she went to the maltsters and the hop factors before the season's prices moved, and bought the best of the year's malt and a great weight of the soundest Kentish hops outright, and paid for them, and laid them in dry, for she had reasoned, standing in the cellar with her gauge, that a hot, dry summer was in the sky, and that a hot summer is the sternest examiner a beer ever sits before, and that she would meet it with the best materials in the county and a cellar cut in the chalk, and let the Marquess meet it with his steam and his hurry, and let the drinkers of 3 parishes be the judges between them in September. And then she went back to her coppers, and did all through that lengthening spring the one unspectacular thing that was in the end to undo him. She brewed sound, and hopped hard, and racked nothing green, and laid by her bottle of every gile, and she waited for the weather, with the particular patience of a person who has read the account before it is cast up, and knows to a farthing how it must come out. The weather came as she had read it. That summer of 1826 was the hottest and the driest within the memory of any man then living. The Wen shrank to a chain of warm green pools. The water meadows cracked, the very hop gardens hung limp, and week after blazing week the county lay under a heat that turned milk in the pantry between the drawing and the churning, and put every cellar in 3 parishes to the hardest trial a cellar ever meets. It was the making of the great brewery's opening, and though no man on its board yet knew it, the unmaking of its beer. For the chimney had been lit at last in June, with a dinner and a deal of speech-making, and the manufactory had begun to pour out porter upon the tied houses at a rate and a price no hand brewer could touch, and Mr. Pruitt, with a great capital crying for its first dividend and a hot trade roaring for drink, had done in the fact precisely the thing that Cass Tarrant had foretold in the theory. He had hurried it. The porter was mashed thin and boiled short of hops to save the cost of them, and drawn off the squares green and racked while it was still working, into casks that a manufactory in a hurry had not the hands to scour as old Barnaby scoured his. And it was sent out warm into the warm cellars of frightened publicans who had been given no choice but to take it, in the fierce heat of the worst July in living memory. And a green beer, thin-hopped and foul-casked and warm-cellared in such a heat, does one thing, and does it without fail, and cares nothing for the capital invested in it. It ropes, and it sours, and it turns. The great brewery's own head brewer had said as much, and been overruled, and it is only justice to him to record it. Mr. Doggett was an old trade brewer of the honest sort, hired by the board for the look of his experience, and then forbidden the use of it, who had stood over those hurried squares in June, with a face growing longer by the day, and had told Mr. Pruitt to his face that the porter was not sound, only young, that it wanted a fortnight more in the square and twice the hops, and a cool month in a clean cask before it saw a publican's cellar, and that to rack it green and force it out in such a heat was to sell rope and sour by August, and the brewery's name with it. Mr. Pruitt had heard him out with his soft civility and had asked whether Mr. Doggett proposed to pay the interest on the capital out of his own pocket during the fortnight in question, and had then given the order to rack, and Doggett, who was a brewer and not a hero and had a family, had racked it, with the particular sick misery of a good workman made to spoil his own work, and had begun that same week, without a word to anybody, to look about him quietly for another place, and to think with an odd and growing frequency of the sealed bottles they said the Tarrant girl kept in her chalk cellar by the bridge. By the 2nd week of August, the thing had happened all over the county at once, as a thing long prepared happened suddenly. The porter turned in the tied houses from the mead's own gates to the edge of the next shire, cask after cask broached ropey and stinking, ale that pulled like oil and stank like a stagnant ditch, undrinkable and unsellable and paid for, and the tied publicans who had been forced to take it and forbidden any other found their cellars full of poison they could not sell, and their quarter day come round, and the Marquess's bailiff at the door for the rent, and no beer to draw, and no money to pay, and nowhere to turn, for they had been tied hand and foot to the one house whose beer had failed them. It was ruin, and it was a ruin of the Marquess's own precise manufacture, for he had first taken from these men every choice but his beer, and then given them a beer that destroyed them. And the county, which is never slow to see a joke against a great man once the great man has furnished it, began to see this one, and to repeat under the striped awnings of its own smaller entertainments the observation of Miss Tarrant of the old Brewhouse concerning a beer being worth what it was 3 months on, and not a farthing of what it was the day it was racked. And through it all, in the 11 houses by the bridge, Tarrant's beer stood in Barnaby's scoured casks in the cool of good cellars and did not turn. The malt shovel drew sound ale to a taproom fuller than it had been in years, and honest Kettle told any gentleman who would listen exactly why. And the old brewhouse that a Marquess had pronounced finished in May could not, in that broiling August, brew fast enough to answer the thirst of a county that had suddenly and painfully rediscovered the difference between beer and the promise of beer. The Marquess of Calder was not a stupid man, and this is the place to say it, for the story does him the justice his conduct earns and no more. But he was a proud one, and a proud man's first act upon the failure of his own scheme is very seldom to examine the scheme, and is very often to look about for the person whose obstinacy is plainly the cause of it. He had a great capital sunk and cronking for its dividend, a board of frightened subscribers, a county beginning to laugh, and a cellar somewhere by the bridge whose beer had insolently declined to fail when his own had so signally succeeded in it, and instead of asking why his porter had turned, he asked, with the whole force of an injured self-love, how the Tarrant beer could possibly be as sound as the impudent town pretended, and satisfied himself, upon no evidence but his need, that it could not be, that it was luck, or a cool cellar, or a small brew easily minded, or very likely a good deal of publican's brag, and a little quiet doctoring of the casks. And he resolved, against the advice of the one honest brewer left on his premises, to prove it so in public, and mend his credit at a stroke. He would hold a tasting. He would bring his own celebrated porter and the Tarrant beer to the market-place, before the whole town at the September fair, and set them side by side, and expose the pretence of the little brewhouse before the very people who were laughing at his own. And he had so far persuaded himself of the outcome that he never once asked the only question a brewer would have asked first, which was how old the bottle was that Miss Tarrant would bring. The tasting was held, as these things are, before the largest company the town could muster, in the long room of the Woolpack on the afternoon of the September fair, with the Marquess and his board at the head of the table, and Mr. Pruitt at his shoulder, and half the county crowded to the walls, and it began as a public execution, and ended as a different one. The Marquess's porter was brought first, a fine fresh butt of it new from the mead, and broached with some ceremony, and it was, to do it justice, a handsome-looking beer in the glass, dark and bright, not yet 3 weeks racked, and not yet turned, and the board looked easier at the sight of it. Then Cass Tarrant, who had come at the invitation in her plain navy gown with old Barnaby carrying a small basket behind her, was asked, with a courtesy that did not trouble to hide its confidence, to produce the celebrated Tarrant beer, and she set upon the table not a fresh cask at all, but a single small stone bottle, sealed with wax and dust upon it. and said, in the level and unhurried voice the county was by now beginning to lean forward to hear, that she thought a fresh beer no fair test of anything, since any fool could brew a beer that was pleasant for a fortnight, and that the whole question between the mead and the bridge was not what a beer was in September, but what it would be the September after, and that this bottle had been drawn and sealed and laid in her cellar in the October of the year before, 11 months since, and had lain in the chalk untouched from that day to this, and that she would be glad to have it broached beside his lordship's new butt, and let the company judge between the two which house understood the keeping of beer. And she gave the bottle to Mr. Doggett, the Marquess's own head brewer, standing unhappy at the board, and asked him, as the one man present whom nobody could accuse of partiality to her, to draw the cork himself, and to say honestly before them all what he found. There are moments a proud man sees coming a half-second before they arrive, and cannot stop, and the Marquess had one of them then, in the drawing of that cork, for he saw, in the sudden stillness of old Doggett's face as the wax came away, that he had walked his own credit into a trap of his own building, and that the trap had been baited a year ago by a woman drawing off a pint by lantern light against exactly this afternoon, and that there was now no honourable way out of the room but through. Doggett drew the cork. The 11-month beer came into the glass bright and clear, and threw a close creamy head, and filled the long room with the clean round smell of sound old ale, and Doggett smelled it, and held it to the window, and tasted it slowly with the whole company silent, and set it down, and said, in the flat unhappy voice of an honest man, doing the one honest thing left to him, that it was as sound a beer as he had tasted in 40 years in the trade, that it had a 12-month in it and would take another, that it was full hopped and cleanly made, and had never worked in a foul cask in its life, and that there was no doctoring on this earth that could counterfeit it, for time was the one thing no brewer could fake, and this beer had honestly kept its time. And then, because he was asked, and because he had made up his mind that morning that he would not be forsworn for any board in England, he tasted the Marquess's fine fresh butt again, slowly in the same silence, and set it down, and said more quietly still, that it was a well-coloured beer, and a young one, and that he would not like to answer for what it would be by Christmas, for it was racked green and short of hops, and that he had said as much in June, and would say it again now, and the board might do with him as it pleased. The little sealed bottle, laid by a spinster in a chalk cellar, against a day she could not have named, had broached the whole of the Marquess's scheme as surely as it broached itself, and the discredit he had brought to the Woolpack to hang upon the old brewhouse settled instead, before the eyes of the entire laughing county, upon the tall new chimney on the mead. It should have ended there, and in a simpler man it would have, but the Marquess's pride, driven from the field of the beer, made its last stand upon the woman. And it is this that gives the story its turn, and casts Tarrant her finest hour. For Mr. Pruitt, seeing his master's face, and his own scheme in the same ruin, leaned in and said the thing that close hard men always have by them for such a moment, said it low, but not so low that the head of the table missed it, and the head of the table, God forgive him, in the misery of his exposure for one instant half believed it, that all this was very pretty, but that a woman's cellar book and her little sealed bottles were no evidence a court or a board need respect, that it was housewife's work and sentiment corked up in a bottle, that anybody might keep one sound bottle by for show, and that the whole performance was a trick of the fair, and Miss Tarrant's success no more than the luck of a cool cellar and a small brew, and a good deal of publicans. Bragg got up to shame her betters. And the Marquess, stung and shamed and grasping, let his eyes go to her as though the slander might be a rope out of the pit, and did not at once say no. Cass Tarrant looked at the two of them for a moment in her considering way, as though what they had said might presently be weighed against the book, and found, as it was, light. And then she did not raise her voice, for she never did. She said that Mr. Pruitt was very welcome to his opinion of her sealed bottles, and that she had brought, as it happened, the means of curing him of it. And she had old Barnaby set the basket upon the table, and take from it not one bottle but 9, each sealed and dusty and written over in her small square hand, the trials of 9 autumns running, and she set them in a row before the board like a squared account, and said that here was every beer her house had made these 9 years, the 2 poor ones with the good, each laid by the year it was brewed, and none of them opened till this hour, and that the company might choose any bottle of any year they pleased, at random, by the date upon the wax, and broach it then and there, and taste for themselves whether the old brewhouse kept one sound bottle by for show, or a cellar full of them as a plain matter of trade. Let them draw the corks of the lot, she said, if 9 were not enough. Her father had taught her to keep them precisely, so that no gentleman need ever take her word, and she would a great deal rather be proved than believed. And she turned to the Marquess, and said the only hard thing she said that whole afternoon, in the same level voice which made it the harder, that she was not a correction for a bad summer, my lord, nor a convenience to be produced when his own beer had shamed him, that she had been a brewer in May, when he told her to sell her coppers for scrap, and was the same brewer in September, that a cool cellar had not made, and a hot one had only proved, and that he might taste her 9 bottles and welcome, but that he would take no terms from her that afternoon, then or after, for she did not do business across a table where her word had just been called a housewife's fancy, and she wished the board a very good day. And she left the 9 bottles standing on the table as her witnesses, and walked out of the Woolpack composed, with old Barnaby and his empty basket behind her, and did not once look to see whether the Marquess watched her go, which the whole room being able to attest that he did, and bareheaded too, was rather the completest thing she could have done. Here we must, for a while, look through the other window, for the remainder of the story is the Marquess's to travel and not hers, and it is only by seeing it as he came to see it that the reader will understand why a proud man's defeat became the truest thing that ever happened to him. He went home from the Woolpack that evening a good deal changed, though he would not for some days admit by what. And he did the thing that pride does when the beer has failed, and the woman has walked out, and the county is laughing, which is that, at last, having no one left to blame, he began to examine the scheme. He sent for the brewery's books, not the fair figures, Mr. Prout had drawn but the true ones, and he sat up 3 nights over them with a branch of candles and a slow and dreadful understanding, and he found in them, entry by entry, the whole of what Cass Tarrant had told him for nothing under the awning in May. The hops left out to save the cost, the fortnight in the square struck off to hurry, the dividend. The green beer racked against the head brewer's written protest, the foul casks, the whole handsome ruin costed to a farthing in his own agent's copperplate. And he found, kept quietly in a second book, that Mr. Pruitt had not meant him to see, the true reckoning of the tied houses, the debts bought up and called in, the publicans coerced, the little brewers starved out, and understood at last that his great modern scheme had been, from the first foundation stone, precisely the vile kind of tie that an honest brewer will not stoop to, and that the only difference between his brewery and Cass Terence was that she had bound her houses by being fair to them for 20 years, and he had bound his by being cruel to them for one, and that the beer had known the difference even when he had not. He dismissed Mr. Pruitt within the week, and without a character, and he kept old Doggett, and raised him, and asked his advice, and took it, and then, having set his own house in what order he could, he did the last and hardest thing, which was to put on his hat and walk down to the bridge alone. He came to the old brewhouse on a bright, cool October forenoon, a year and some months from the day he had told her to sell her coppers. And he came as she had made men come before him, bareheaded to the plain oak counter with his tall hat against his breast, and everything he saw as he waited for her was reasoned, and he had by now the wit and the humility to see that it was. The yard was swept and busy, the deep vaults breathed their even chalky cool up the cellar stairs in the middle of the heat. The casks stood scoured and sweet in their rows. The shelf of sealed bottles ran back into the dark, a plain, unanswerable account of 40 years of not being ashamed. And the woman who kept it all came up from the cellar with ink on her fingers and her gauge in her hand, and looked at him without triumph and without fear, as though he were a jobber come with a bargain she would examine on its merits, and not a moment before. He said his business plainly, which was more than he had ever done under the awning, that she had been right upon every particular, and he wrong upon all of them, that his beer had failed exactly as and exactly when she said it would, and hers had kept exactly as she said it would, and that he had come to ask, if she would sell it to a man who had not deserved to buy, whether the old brewhouse would take on the tied houses his own folly had ruined, and their poor publicans with them, and brew for the town the sound beer he had not had the sense to let them keep. He asked it as a favor, and named no price, having learned that much, and he waited, hat in hand, for the woman he had called finished to tell him what her forbearance would cost him. What it cost him surprised him, as her prices always afterward surprised him, by being less than his necessity would have paid, and a great deal more than his pride had expected. She did not gouge him, though she might have, for she held the sound houses, and he held 11 ruined ones, and a chimney he could not feed. She named for the whole of the great brewery, and its poisoned tie a figure so plainly fair that Mr. Doggett, when he heard it, went away and thought about it for an hour, and when the Marquess, wondering, asked her why she did not take him at his need as any man of business would, she gave him the answer that he carried about with him for the rest of his life, and quoted to his aunt, and at last to his children. She said that she meant to sell this town its beer for the next 30 years, and to his house after him, and that a brewer who ruins a neighbor in a hard season buys herself a bad name that outlasts the bargain, that his successor's custom was worth a great deal more to her than his bad afternoon, and the town's goodwill more than either, and that she would take his brewery at a fair price, and keep his ruined publicans on, and brew them a beer they need not be ashamed to sell, not because she forgave him, she said this without heat, as a plain term of trade, but because it was better business to be trusted for 30 years than feared for one, and she had always, she said, preferred a long account to a sharp one. It was the Marquess's final and most complete instruction in the difference between the front of a thing and the back of it, and he had the grace this time to walk round to the back and look. The tied houses were saved, and the publicans kept, and the great chimney on the mead brewed sound beer within the 12-month under old Doggett's honest hand and Cass Tarrant's honest book. And the county, which had laughed first at her and then at the Marquess, ended by taking a considerable local pride in them both, in the manner of counties, and told the story of the 9 bottles at the Woolpack for a generation, improving it as it went. The Marquess of Calder was not punished, for the story is not of that kind, and he did not grovel, for she would have thought less of him if he had. He was out-reasoned, and out-kept, and converted by the plain evidence of a beer, and he came to her afterward not as a penitent, but as a pupil, which suited them both a great deal better. He took to walking down to the bridge of an evening upon one pretext or another, to be taught the things his figures had left out, the reading of the gauge, the smell of a working square, the trick of knowing by the hand alone whether a cellar was cool enough to trust, and it was observed by Mrs. Peverell, who observed everything, that a man does not spend a wet October learning the theory of hops from a woman he means only to buy a brewery from, and that the Marquis's education was proceeding upon lines that would end, if the town were any judge, at the altar of Marholm Church. The town was a judge, and it did. His aunt, the Dowager Lady Rowe, a plain-spoken old woman who had watched the whole affair from town with a dry relish, put the case to him herself when he told her how it stood, and he was honest enough to laugh at it. She observed that he had gone down into Hertfordshire the year before to buy up a troublesome little brewhouse, and be rid of it, and appeared now to be proposing, at very considerable trouble and expense, to marry it instead, and asked whether, upon reflection, he could tell her what precisely he had meant by that speech under the awning about the caudle cup, of which the whole county still spoke. And the Marquess of Calder, the most modern and the least anxious gentleman upon that side of the shire, found that he could not for the life of him remember what he had meant by it at all, could not recover one syllable of the certainty that had made him say it, and told his aunt so, and understood in the telling that this forgetting was the exact measure of how far he had come from the man who had said it. For the thing he had thought so obvious, that a woman need not be looked at while it was said, had turned out, on examination, to have no back to it whatever, and a thing with no back to it is soon indistinguishable, even to the man who built it, from the empty air it was always made of. He asked her plainly at the last, and not across a business table, and she considered him in her weighing way, as though his question too must be proved and not merely believed, and then accepted him upon her own terms, which were that the Brewhouse book should be kept, as it had always been kept, in her own hand, and that she should go on being a brewer, for she had no notion of leaving off a thing she did well to take up being a marchioness, a thing she should have to learn, and he, who had at last acquired sense enough to know his good fortune when it stood before him, with ink on its fingers, agreed to every word of it, and thought himself let off cheap, and was right. They were married in the spring, quietly, at Marholm Church, with old Nathaniel giving her away glad and shaking, and old Barnaby scrubbed pink in the second pew, and honest, Kettle of the malt shovel, and all 11 publicans filling the back of the church in their Sunday coats, and at the wedding breakfast, which was held in the long, cool room of the old brewhouse, and not at Calder Court. The bride caused to be brought up from the chalk vault a single small stone bottle, sealed with wax and thick with dust, and set it before her husband to broach with his own hand. It was drawn and sealed, she told him, in the October of the year he had told her the brewhouse was finished, and she thought he might like to taste. Now, what had been quietly keeping in the dark all the while he had been so sure it could not last. He drew the cork, and the beer of the year he had called her finished came into the glass after its long patience, bright and sound and sweet, throwing its close head and filling the room with the clean round smell of a thing honestly made and honestly kept. And he tasted it and looked at her over the glass, and had the good sense to say nothing at all, which was the wisest thing he had learned to do in the whole of his education. And that is the end of it, or nearly, for a beer keeps a truer account than any man, and can be neither flattered nor hurried into swearing to a lie, and will tell you in its own good autumn the exact truth of what was done in the spring, whether the doer be a spinster by a bridge or a marquess with a chimney. And what is made sound in the making, and stands, and what is forced will turn, though you gild the cask with a lord's own arms, and christen it before the quality. On the mantel of the long room at the old brewhouse, where they chose to live the half of every year, there stood ever, after a single sealed stone bottle from the October he had called her finished, never opened and never meant to be, only kept, because it had never needed opening to be true, and needed no drinking now to go on being so. It only needed to have been honestly filled, and honestly laid by, and honestly let alone. If a story of a patient beer, and a woman with a better account than her betters was worth an hour of your evening, you might let the old brewhouse know it, a word set down below, that the tale kept sound to the end is the only receipt a teller ever asks, and there will be another laid by, and drawn in its own good time, whenever you have a mind to taste it.